underwater exhaust, and the generous exhaust outlet, which isn't so generous.
It's tiny, very restrictive in comparison to this one.
Yeah, a little bit, I guess. So anyway, what we're getting at here is that we've run all these motors, and we've made comparisons between all of them. And it really seems like the Indian would be the underperformer of the whole group. And we basically attributed that performance to the redesigned muffler. And it's deceiving because it looks quite big.
Hey,
it looks bigger.
Bill, are you running for public office? Because it seems like they're an underperformer. Yeah. They're a dog.
So anyway, the exhaust looks big compared to the Hartford exhaust. It looks quite big, but in fact, the fins make it look big, but it's really a very small expansion.
Quite
chamber.
Restrictive compared to this one right here.
It is very restrictive. Yeah. So that would attribute the performance difference.
But it looks like it's got a lot more.
A little bit there, sure.
Space
here. It does have more.
Yeah, but still, I don't know what it is about the engine, but it just doesn't perform at all. And that early Hartford cast iron head one went like smoke.
So Indian added this exhaust, and they also added the throttle from their motorcycle. It's the same handle as a motorcycle. Obviously, they needed a new casting here, and a means to hook the handle to the carburetor. And it's hooked right to the carburetor. I have it unhooked. I have it disconnected now because this is a stiff cable, and it will certainly break this fragile casting. So I just leave it off, and
as opposed to this, which just had that's for control.
There's nothing here. I mean, they just had a hookup for rope steering,
control,
and it was just I mean, it had.
So where's the steering hookup for the Indian?
The later ones had tabs on the bottom of the gas tank,
like the Lockwood.
That you could hook.
But this one doesn't have.
No,
doesn't have that.
So I don't know why this one doesn't have that, but
maybe somebody that worked for Alto went to work for the Indian Motorcycle Company. I mean, Alto didn't believe in having any hookups for anything.
Right. Yeah, the control systems were very slow to be implemented in the late 20s.
Okay. I mean,
some manufacturers were way behind, and other manufacturers.
I mean, this one's got it. Right. And this is earlier than this.
Yeah, this one's ready to go in a boat, hook up to a boat.
Right.
It's completely ready to
for
go.
For remote control and for steering. And this one does not have it, and it's a later deal.
Yeah, well, the design passed into a company that the Indian people probably didn't have a lot of boat experience. And they probably didn't have a lot of two-stroke experience. And so they came up with this, and I mean, you could be sold on one of these if you read the promotional material. There you go. There's an advertisement.
Now, an Indian for the waterways.
Yeah, you see.
All right.
And
all right.
There's also some other material. Of course, I'm all mixed up here. You'll probably have to edit some of this out, but I do have an Indian. So there we go. Indian was promoted in 1930 February Motorboating magazine, and you could read all that and probably want to buy one.
Really, I got to read that.
Yeah. So it was because the Indian company was much larger than Graham Pryor. They had some corporate resources. They had enough people to redesign this thing and promote it and jump in.
And they had enough money to do advertising in motorboating?
I don't think so. That's like a
unsolicited ad?
No, that's not an ad.
I mean,
I'm sure they paid money, but this is just like motorboating at that time would feature every month they feature some product. And
Right.
in the back, there was an
Right.
outboard section, and they feature, and I have many copies with different outboards being
Right?
featured.
No, I've got some of those
Yeah.
myself. I've just never
So
seen the
this
Indian
was
one.
one that was featured. Now, one other interesting piece is that if Gray and Pryor sold to Indian in October of 1929, they had this thing already at the New York Boat Show early January of 1930. So think about that a little bit, right? From October till, that was only maybe 2 months that they could transform the Hartford into an Indian. So that's quite a ambitious, to me, project to do that. I know of one Indian Hartford mix that appears to be original. It's like a hybrid between a Hartford and an Indian, and it has a pre-Indian serial number on it, and it has the Indian exhaust on a Hartford lower unit with a piece of flex pipe down here facing aft. And there's some other really interesting early features on it that one could believe it was something that Indian worked on and Indian made in this prototype transition
Right.
from the real product. Now later, Indian changed this to a sheet aluminum tank, and I don't have one with me here, but sure. So they changed the look a little bit. The sheet tank is a little bit bigger in capacity, and it certainly doesn't affect how the engine runs. All right.
Ready for a stopping
Let's
for a
take
minute?
break. Let's take a break. And,
Okay. So, Bill,
yeah,
1929, October, the end of the month, people were jumping off of buildings.
right.
So this company buys this outboard, and they got to design it. What the hell goes on inside of a company? What are we talking about for the advertising? How do we sell this thing? I mean, what was the fear like?
Full speed ahead.
Full speed ahead.
Full speed ahead. This and the company to look at to answer that question is Johnson. So Johnson had this guy named Warren Ripple in charge. Okay, stock market crashes. The effects of that, as was talked about, took a while for that to take effect. So Warren Ripple is going full speed ahead with Johnson. Okay, the crash happens. He's saying that, okay, I'm going to let the guys that are worried about this worry about that, but we're going to go full speed ahead. And the reason why we're going to go full speed ahead is this crash is very temporary. In 6 months or a year, it's all going to be history, and the demand for our Johnson products is going to be sky high, and we have to be ready for that. And that was the Warren Ripple approach. And the Indian people, I'm sure, had the same idea. They just bought this thing. They quickly brought it into production. It shows up at the New York Boat Show. People look at it. It looks really nice. And
it's an Indian product.
yeah, it's an Indian.
It's Indian. Oh,
You have to
yeah, they
figure
make those.
too. You have to figure too that they were probably in discussions. You know, Indian was probably very deep in discussions with Gray and Pryor months prior
Yeah.
to the crash. You know,
Right.
so you know
Exactly.
that had to have been springtime, I would say, at the latest.
Right.
Right. I would guess.
Yeah.
And that might have been why there was so much pride in that part of the story you told about them selling it for $15,000 because come late October,
Right.
sort of the world had changed.
Yeah,
Right?
I know. So, and that also, I mean, it wasn't explained to me the details of the transition to Indian. But I would guess that, I'm sure George Pryor, being the developer of this design, probably had some interactions with Indian that we don't know about today. But I'm sure that he probably assisted in the Indian people, explaining the tooling. I mean, they sold everything. Everything was necessary to make this thing. Patterns, tooling, fixturing, everything. So when Indian got it, they were really ready to go. And I'm sure that George Pryor probably assisted in that in some way. Yeah. So that's, Indian came and went, and unfortunately, at some point, you know, there's all kinds of stories, Indian mythology stories about, you know, they didn't work well, or one of the myths that was told to me by a fellow that is now deceased, but said that these Indians were put together with the Bosch Magneto with the point cam in the wrong place. And I question that story. When you really look at, I mean, it is possible to unscrew the cam and move it, but it's tooled in such a way that the screw holes are screw holes. But the thought was that Indian was pushing these out the door. They were making them and pushing them out the door, and they were looking for the dealers to kind of clean up the messes. And one of the things they did, they were in such a hurry for, and this is probably also a myth, is that they really were not running the engines in or testing them at the factory. Traditionally, all outboard manufacturers in the 20s and later always had a test area where every outboard motor they made, they tested and ran in a test tank for some period of time. Yeah. And you know, one thought is that maybe Indian didn't do that. The other thing that is interesting is that as this Hartford evolved, it started with very, very wide rings. It started with rings that are 3/16 wide, which is quite a wide, very wide ring.
Yeah.
And these wide rings take a long time to seat into a new cylinder. And at some point, in fact, this example has rings, or originally had rings that were only 1/8 wide, which was more in keeping with the rest of the industry. And look at any of these other, like, later 20s outboards, and they're basically 1/8 wide rings, other than Eltos. But at some point, again, Hartford went to about a 1/8 wide ring, and then when Indian got it, they went right back out to for some reason, the 3/16 wide ring, which would be trouble.
Like I said, an Alto engineer must have gone to work for,
Yeah.
Here we go with the Altos.
Here we go. Right. So anyway, I mean, there were some problems probably with the Indians that we don't, know the whole history. There's a lot of myth. All of these engines are good for a two-stroke. They're big bore, short stroke. So they're a 2.5-inch bore and only a 2-inch stroke. And on a two-stroke, that's a little bit pushing the edge of having enough crankcase compression and scavenging and all that. So, the design might have been a little bit on the edge.
So it wouldn't take much to throw it off.
Right.
If you had two
Right.
smaller boys, if your porting was a little bit off, or your restriction, your exhaust was a little bit too heavy.
Rings not quite seated.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
And even today when I've worked on these, I've had plenty of trouble with them. So some of the details, again, the Hartford pioneered it, but Indian persisted, and they had cylinders that had an aluminum cylinder, but with a cast iron liner, heat shrunk in, okay, and the thought was, well, the advantage is it's a lighter, and there might have been a little with the Hartfords too. Either the Grays or the Pryors had a summer place on Watch Hill, Rhode Island. I think it was the Grays. And these things probably saw some saltwater use, okay, which is death for an iron cylinder. So at some point, maybe George said, well, we can make the motor lighter. We can also do an aluminum cylinder, and it won't be so bad in the salt water. So there could be some little bit to that story as well that we don't know the whole answer to.
God, you've got a bimetallic. You've got a battery there when you've got an aluminum head. Yeah.
Well, we got a battery everywhere in these things. They didn't really understand that.
Well, yeah, but they were heavy enough, so it wasn't an issue. But you get into the 50s, and
it
it gets
anyway
difficult.
So